But what I found interesting when I did begin my work in history, and because of my interest in Orientalism and colonial and post-colonial studies, was that textbooks in English, American textbooks on history and world history, are exceptionally Eurocentric themselves, as we would understand. I mean, it's something that we're not surprised about. But what does seem to surprise me, at least, is that often not only do we find a disproportionate amount of material on Western history in world history textbooks, but also in the textbooks that are translated into Persian, into Farsi, we see this same degree of disproportion allocated to Western history. And even our own history is translated from English to Persian. And what is even more depressing is that the history of Southeast Asia we receive from Europe. The history of the Indian subcontinent we receive from Europe. The history of China we receive from Europe. And of course, this has implications. Because after all, Western history textbooks and Western texts in general, academic texts, are to a very large degree influenced by Orientalist discourse. And since the scholars here have already described what it means, Orientalist discourse, I won't go into great detail, but I just want to recall or remind you that Orientalism, it describes the various schools of thought or methods of investigation through which Europe, and now the United States as well, came to know the so-called East. And of course, the East is something very vague and non-existent in reality. So according to scholars like Seyyed, and I personally think that Seyyed himself is very much entrapped, or was very much entrapped in Orientalist discourse, but that of course is my personal opinion. People like him believe that it is through this discourse and the construction of knowledge through this discourse that the West has been able to dominate the rest of the world and to legitimize its hold of the so-called uncivilized other. And of course, some of the features of Orientalism is that the Orient is primitive, it's mysterious, it's exotic, it's incapable of self-government. You even see it in books, even very recent books about Iran, the Persian Puzzle by Pollock, as if Iran is some sort of mystery, whereas people who live in Iran, for people who live in Iran, there's no mystery surrounding it. But for a very large public who reads such texts, this mystery seems to exist. So while the idea of representation is based upon a notion, often at least, that it is faithful to the original, often representation is interwoven with other issues as well. It's not simple truth. And therefore, but then we have two problems here. One is that Orientalist representations of, let's say, Iran, of Muslims, of Asians, of Hindus, of the Chinese, of Africans, of West Africa, South Africa, because after all, Africa is not a monolithic entity, just as Asia isn't. And the same is true with Latin America, South America. One major problem that we face is, of course, that you have this you often have a stereotypical Orientalist discourse. And it influences the way people in the West or the metropolis view the rest of the world. But what is even more dangerous is how often Orientalist discourse, because of its sheer power, is able to influence the way in which the so-called Orientals view themselves. In other words, a sort of split consciousness develops, as we call in Black studies, where a community of people views itself, an individual views himself or herself as through the eyes of their community, their own people. But at the same time, they view themselves from the eyes of the European, the American, the metropolis, the center of power. How do they do that? They view it through literary texts, more importantly nowadays through film, through television, and through the news. Because after all, it is, we do not, if alternative news sources that from this, excluding those that come from within Iran, they don't come from China, they don't come from India, they don't come from Africa, they don't come from Latin America. They all come from the metropolis, the center of economic wealth and power, which is today the United States and Western Europe.
Now remember, class, please take this new history book with a grain of salt, since it focuses primarily on the history of white Western males.
Hi. Today I want to give a personalized message to the group of people who have been commonly mislabeled Afrocentrics because 1, I have some grievances with them, and I want to clear the air on some of these grievances. 2, I share the frustration and concern with society that many of them have. And 3, I commonly find myself wandering in the racial debate sphere of YouTube and constantly come across you guys. Instead of doing another response to a video like everyone is doing, I decided I was going to do something a little different this time. The goal of this video is twofold. The first goal of this video will be to attempt to generate productive dialogue, however futile, and the other will be to provide insight into the racial dynamics of this issue. While the things that I say may not be meaningful to many of the so-called Afrocentrics due to the differing reasons for their beliefs, the message of this video may be relevant to and resonate with some. Before I begin, I want to make something absolutely clear. Despite what many are trying to tell me, I do not believe that Afrocentrism is anywhere near comparable to Eurocentrism. While there are many similarities, there are also many differences. Eurocentrism is about the maintaining of cultural superiority, while Afrocentrism is an attempt to restore a lost historical legacy. Eurocentrism is about maintaining white supremacy and power. It is the actual focus on and overglorification of European culture and the downplaying of other cultures. Afrocentrism, on the other hand, is about running away from one's actual culture and trying to insert one's own people into certain periods of others' history. Eurocentrism has played a massive role in the misery of people for centuries. It's still prevalent in American culture and is still playing a role in current systems of oppression. The same cannot be said for Afrocentrism. With all of this being said, I still think that many of the things you guys do is outright disturbing, such as the attempt to steal the Mississippian culture from the Native Americans. This is deplorable for many reasons, the strongest of which is that Native Americans, like African Americans, are an oppressed minority group whose place in history and American culture is not being fully recognized. If you want to help change the perception of African Americans and our history, you should be doing things that will generate new allies and not new enemies. Now, I think that it will be more appropriate to simply call you guys pro-blacks, because many of you seem to be affiliated with the Black Power movement, and justifiably so, and many of you seem to be subscribing to radical beliefs about history in an attempt to lift your own self-esteem and the self-esteem of others. While I believe this is a noble and worthwhile goal, I believe that there are simpler and more effective ways of boosting the pride of African Americans and gaining respect from other races. In the area of history, this can be achieved by embarking on the actually academic and rigorous pursuits of the African past, one that is not guided by a complete and total distrust of white European scholars who do not tell you what you want to hear, one that is not guided by wishful thinking. It is necessary to question the ideas put forth by scholars to generate the best information possible. But at the same time, the generation of new knowledge is the result of team effort. And team effort requires some form of trust. Trust, which you guys seem to be unwilling to give. Yes, there is a lot of racist nonsense permeating the field of African history, and yes, many of the scholars who study the African past have racist tendencies. But this does not take the form of things like the supposed whitewashing of black civilizations. It takes the forms of things like diffusionism, the lack of research into these areas, and the use of this lack of research to argue that black Africans have achieved very little throughout history. The tainted image of tribal societies, nonsensical hierarchies of civilization, Eurocentric ideas about the progression of culture, Eurocentric ideas about what constitutes an advanced culture, hyperskepticism of indigenous achievements, the surprisingly persistent racism in anthropology, and among other things. As I said earlier, in order to disentangle fact from myth, one needs a balanced, rigorous, and collaborative approach in the pursuit of this information. You have to argue on the basis of the methodology, logic, and evidence, and not based simply on the people presenting the information. This is how you actually spot Eurocentric propaganda, due to the fact that whites are not the only ones pushing it. There are many white Africanists and black Africanist scholars who are working to change these things, and if you want to change the way African history is perceived, and thus how Africans are perceived, if you want to convince anyone other than yourselves that we actually have a history, then it is in your best interest to follow these people, and not people like Clyde Winters, who are scamming you guys for money and have no interest in the truth. African history desperately needs revision, but this is not the way to go about it. Another issue I have with some of these beliefs is that many of these ideas come at the expense of others' heritage, and because of this, it gives a really bad impression of African Americans. This is a bad thing, considering how we are portrayed in the media to begin with. Plus, it's causing a lot of racism, and is being used by white supremacists to spread their hate and dangerous ideologies to people from all parts of the globe. People from all parts of the world who would never normally associate with white supremacist garbage are being brainwashed by it. Two examples of this are 7 Phoenician 7 and Asuperegyptian. It's also being used by propagandists such as Atheism is Unstoppable 4 to portray themselves as the real victims of racism. Not only are you not convincing anyone other than yourselves of these ideas, but you are adding unnecessary racial tension.
Back up. Yeah, you will. You will get hurt out here. Yeah, you will. Back up. Dude, you shouldn't have done that, man. Yes, you will. You walk up on us again, you will get hurt. I did not walk up on you. Yes, you did.
There's a problem with a black man and a white woman?
Yes.
Why?
Because God doesn't want the black man to be with the white woman.
This is.
Well, your father should have got with a black woman.
Well,
and
I guess that we should not have elected.
Don't put your hands on our presence.
Please don't.
Don't put your hands on our presence.
No, but please don't. Please don't.
If you do that again, you might not be able to hear me, but you will definitely.
Yo, get him out of here before he gets hurt. Get him out of here before he gets hurt.
Really? Yeah,
Tell you right now.
You are just a little too close to me.
You already put his hands on us? He's about to get doubled.
You are
drunk? Get him out of here. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir.
You put his hands on him. I don't care if you've been through. I've been through more too.
I will. Yes, sir. I will.
Sure, they will find excuses anyway, but it's not a good idea to add an excuse to the plethora of ones that already exist and are being used. Not only that, but when you interject yourself and take pride in the history of other groups, you inflate their ego and in the process give them a sick and undeserved sense of superiority over us and others. When you do this and then glorify their history, you are not only making yourself seem desperate, but you are also fostering stronger racist convictions and strengthening the illusion that Africans are a people without a history of our own, or at least a history worth mentioning. When you combine this arrogance, the groupthink formed by the alliance of non-blacks who oppose Afrocentrism, and its resulting reinforcement of this arrogance and hatred, and the hostile reaction of blacks who come across this animosity, the result is a vicious, hate-driven, and self-reinforcing cycle of conflict that is matched nowhere on the internet. The racism is so bad that this entire channel was created as a knee-jerk reaction to it. Also, there is a certain racial bias and contempt towards black historical revisionists that is not usually faced by white historical revisionists. And the constant pushing of these ideas on history-related videos and channels gives people the excuses to put this racial bias into action. Plus, it gives people the false impression that Eurocentrism is somehow less prevalent relative to Afrocentrism, distracting them from the fact that Eurocentrism is normalized, is more prevalent on the internet, and is still a rampant real-world problem. This is a bad thing for not only us, but for everyone else as well. Another issue is that some of these beliefs within the pro-black movement is that it is predicated on a lack of concern or an assumption that Africans and the African diaspora are the only ones whose history has been damaged by Eurocentrism. Yes, Africans have been hit the hardest and received the shortest end of the stick, but one must also remember that others' heritage has been hurt as well. Some examples of this are the demonization of Islamic history, the portrayal of Mesopotamians as uncultured savages, the overglorification of Rome, and its subsequent effect on the perception of ancient Carthage, the lack of appreciation and recognition of Islamic and Chinese innovations on Western culture, the bullshit about an Aryan invasion of India, the lack of coverage of the achievements of other cultures during the so-called classical age of Greece, and a whole host of other things. In the case of white supremacy, a larger swath of people have been harmed by it, some of which include certain European groups, like the Irish, the Eastern European Slavic people, and modern-day Greeks. Believe it or not, it is very unlikely that the people who are interested in our history and want to see the perception of it changed are limited to Africa and the so-called Western world. For both practical and moral reasons, the best course of action would be to join forces with these people and not create more myths. I'm not going to get my hopes up and believe that this video will change anybody's mind, but let the message of this video serve as some friendly advice and a warning about the costs and impracticalities of this movement. If you want genuine change to occur, then you cannot go about it the way that you are. Peace.